My friends weren't exactly enthusiastic about meeting me at a place called the Death Ridge Lodge, even after I told them that Death Ridge was just the name of the shepherd who used to own the land. Truth was, I was more than a little nervous myself. I'd been out of the country for 5 years. There had been calls and letters, but my friends and I hadn't seen each other in all that time. Would we still have the connection that we once did? Some of the changes that time had wrought were surprising, others less so. We'd all expected my stubborn, brilliant friend Jennifer to be an attorney like her father, but in a story straight out of a cheesy Hallmark movie, she'd married a guy from a tiny town in Kentucky and had 2 kids. Meanwhile, Ned, a loudmouthed, extroverted redhead, had somehow ended up working from a lonely home office as a computer programmer. And then there was Zoe. She'd been my crush since our sophomore year of college. It wasn't just her auburn hair or piercing green eyes, it was the care and honesty she showed in everything she did. Before her, I'd never met someone who really listened, who really cared about other people without working their own angle. We'd all expected great things for her, but in the end, she'd wound up like me, back in our hometown, unsure about the future. But now that so much time had passed, would we even have anything in common anymore? As it turned out, I needn't have worried. Not even the wailing winter storm and unexpected power outages could dampen our good time. Ned, Zoe, Jennifer, and I gathered around a roaring flagstone fireplace, sharing our favorite scary stories and urban legends. It didn't matter that the howling wind made going outside deadly, or that snow had cut off the forest road to the outside world. We had warmth, food, booze, and our rediscovered friendship. We also had Lee. When we arrived, Lee explained to us that he was the off-season caretaker of Death Ridge Lodge and the surrounding cabins. During tourist season in summer, the place swarmed with hospitality workers, but from fall to spring Lee mostly had the place to himself. When the blizzard hit, he made a point of checking in on us. Temperatures going down out there, he warned us that fateful night. Visibility is almost zero. You kids wouldn't want to get lost out there tonight or any other night. Don't worry, Zoe smiled. We have no intention of going outside in that. She pointed to the wind-driven snow that was rattling against the window panes. It can't be that easy to get lost though, can it? Ned, always the contrarian, asked. I mean, we're on the side of a mountain. To go one way you just go down, and to go the other way you just go back up, right? Not that simple, Lee grunted, pulling up a stool. We're 100 miles from civilization out here, and if you can't recognize any landmarks, all them pine trees out there look the same. Even if you think you know where you're going, this mountain likes to play tricks. The gentle slope you walk down and fall might be dangerously steep in spring. Boulders tumble, streams change course, and paths disappear from one season to the next. There's dozens of trails crisscrossing this all mountain, 1,800 seconds logging roads, game trails, other paths so old it's impossible to tell who made 'em. Trust me, you lose your way out there, all you're gonna get is more and more lost ... and then you'll start to panic. And at that point, if hypothermia and hunger and the bears don't get you, all man Death Ridge and his dogs will. Death Ridge, dogs, Zoe and Jennifer asked at once. Just how much do you four know about Death Ridge Lodge? Not much, I admitted. I was looking for a place where my old friends and I could meet up over the holidays. The place looked cozy, had hiking and skiing and good reviews. Besides, back then, the weather forecast said we'd have a clear weekend. Lee nodded, as if that was about what he expected. It's an odd place ... with an odd history. Just after the Revolutionary War, a man named Jebediah Death Ridge showed up here and started construction on a cabin. He said that the mountain had called to him, that he'd seen it in a dream, and that Patrick Henry had gifted him the entire mountainside in exchange for services rendered during the war. There was plenty of land back then, and grants were being handed out like candy, so no one called him on it. Besides, folks wanted farmland, not the slope of a damn mountain. They all thought Jeb Death Ridge was crazy, but he carved a life out of these hills, swearing that he and the land were one flesh. Jeb and his sons felled forest, dragged out the stumps, and planted orchards. They set up secret garden patches back in the woods, raised chickens, cows, and a flock of sheep. For a while, things were good. The old man stared into the fire. If you young people get bored with all this history, just say so. Well, it's not like we've got anything better to do we? Ned scoffed. No, please go on. It's interesting, Zoe reassured Lee. Ned rolled his eyes. Well, the years rolled by. Jeb died and passed his land on to his son and grandson, who went on living the same way he had. Meanwhile, towns were building up around the mountain. The more they expanded, the more folks demanded proof that the mountain really belonged to the Deathriches. By the end of the Civil War, that's to say, Jeb's great-grandson's time, nobody cared about yellowed papers and ancient claims. Folks wanted the mountain developed and kept suing till they found a judge who agreed with them. Amos Deathrich got a few acres and the rest went to minin and logging companies. But taking advantage of the Deathrich land was no easy task. See, the Deathriches refused to accept the court's decision. They kept living in their hidden shacks on the mountainside and made life hell for the companies who, from their point of view, were trespassing on their property. Every day there were downed trees on the road, supplies burnt, animals missing. It went on for decades, all the way into the 1900 seconds. And while nobody had been hurt in Amos Deathrich's little guerrilla war, it was costing those companies more than the mountain was worth. They had to put a stop to it. The first sign of trouble was when Alice Deathrich, Amos' wife from back east, stopped coming into town to sell her honey and fruit preserves. A few days later, Amos was found in the middle of a dirt logging road, surrounded by his 3 mastiffs. They'd all been shot to pieces. 10 years later, some trappers found Alice and the kids in a shallow grave. They said it looked like they'd died, badly. So who did it? Jennifer asked. Well, nobody can prove nothing about nothing, but a group of flashy out-of-towners rode in on the last train from Chicago that night and left in the morning. Folks in town said they saw lantern lights going up the logging road and gunfire in the hollers. Lee stared thoughtfully into the fireplace. In a way, though, I guess you could say the Deathriches won out in the end. The mountain never yielded enough timber or coal to justify the expense. The companies that had fought so hard over the mountain, and even killed to keep it, all went bankrupt a few years later. This place was practically abandoned till the national parks craze took off in the 1950s. Some clever investors bought it off the bank for pennies. They built the cabins and lodge that we're sitting in today. But what does all that have to do with old man Deathrich and his dogs? Well, the mountain wasn't completely left alone after all them companies closed down. The local men came up here to hunt, grandmothers collected fruit from the Deathrich's woodland orchards, and the teenagers, well, they came up here to do what teenagers do. But over the years, rumors began to trickle down about strange sightings in these woods. Some folks got to thinking that maybe Amos Deathrich wasn't really dead. Or if he was still around somehow. You mean like a ghost? I ventured. You call it what you want. Lee prodded the dying embers. I'm just telling it how I heard it, and you wouldn't believe some of the tales the folks in town have about this mountain. Like all Bruce Higgins, who came back from deer hunting all bitten and tore up, with his rifle missing. He said he'd been chased down the mountain by 3 snarling shepherd dogs. Just like those huge mastiffs found shot to death beside Amos. Miss Nellie Price said she saw the all-man himself stalking through the trees with a 100-year-old hunting rifle and a sack of dead rabbits slung over his shoulder. Lee rambled on. Jennifer tried to hide a smile. I'm sorry, she chuckled. It's just ... My dad was a hunter and he used to see things in the woods too. Usually after his 5th beer. And my great-aunt Mildred was convinced she was hearing whispers in her walls until my mother got rid of the bird's nest in her chimney. The birdsong had been echoing in the pipes. It sounded like real human voices. My point is, there's a snowball effect with stories like these. They live rent-free in the back of people's minds, and when they see something they can't explain, they just keep adding to them. I'm not saying you're wrong, Lee grumbled. I've never seen All Man Amos myself, and I've lived up here all my life. But I will say that there's something off about this mountain. Maybe it goes all the way back to Jeb Deathrich, or even before that. Otherwise, how can you account for all the disappearances? Like the 4 high schoolers who went camping up here on a dare back in the 1970s. Nothing was left of them but a trampled down tent and the soggy ashes of their fire. Wasn't there an investigation? Zoe asked. Oh, sure there was. The police concluded that the girls had run away from home. Then when Terry Bannister and his 9-year-old son didn't come back from their Hicken trip, they blamed wolves. When a local artist's car was found along a log-in road with spikes in the tires and the driver's side door hanging off of its hinges, they called it an abandoned vehicle. They just towed it back into town and didn't even look for her. Don't you see where I'm going with this? Ever since the login and Minnan dried up, tourism is the only thing keeping those little towns afloat. The ghost of Amos Dietrich and his 3 hellhounds makes for a fine local legend, but if the summer crowd ever found out about the real, horrible crimes that happen up on this mountain every year, it'd be the death of the whole industry. I call bullshit. Ned laughed. This sounds an awful lot like a scary story that locals used to scare us wide-eyed out-of-towners with. Am I right? Call it what you want. Lee shrugged again. But I wouldn't go outside till the storm passes, if I were you. He pulled on his boots and wrapped himself in his winter gear, so weathered and worn that it was all the same uniform tone of grayish-brown. You kids got everything you need. We nodded. He waved to us as he trudged out the door. Stay safe out there. I called out too late. The only response was the rattling of the screen door and the howling of the wind, if it was the wind. I thought of the savage jaws of enormous mastiffs and shuddered. We all slept beside the fireplace that night. Everyone had their own excuse. Ned claimed the rooms were too cold. Zoe said she wanted to have a slumber party. Jennifer had already fallen asleep in her chair. But I knew our real reason for keeping close to each other was that Lee's tale had unnerved all of us more than we would have liked to admit. We craved the primal comforts of fire, warmth, and companionship. Before going to sleep, I dared to take a look out the frozen window, but all I could see was blackness. Too cold even for a ghost, I told myself with a chuckle, before stirring the fire and curling up in one of the lodge's thick blankets. My dreams were haunted by worm-eaten faces in shallow graves and shadowy figures on desolate mountain paths. I woke before anyone else in the morning. I'd always loved the peace of being awake while others slept. I took my time making my coffee and examining what the storm had done to the mountainside. The trees were bent, icy spikes stabbing into an ominous gray sky. At least a foot of snow covered the lodge patio. Frigid air blasted my face as I heaved open the sliding glass door and stepped out into the winter wonderland. Beautiful as it was, something more than the cold was bothering me. It took me a moment to fully realize what it was. There were no footprints leading to the cabin where Lee was staying. True, maybe the snow had filled them in, but no smoke rose from the chimney either. Where had Lee gone? I was leaning out over the railing for a better view when I heard a low growl behind me. I wasn't alone on the patio. Half-frozen drool hung from the mastiff's gaping jaws, its hazel eyes burned with fury. Another identical dog growled behind me. They were trying to cut off my escape. I bolted for the door and slid it shut just before a mouth as large as my face smashed into the glass, cracking it. The enormous dog lunged again, widening the spiderweb pattern on the glass. Barks and howls chilled my blood. My friends were waking, but not fast enough. Just a few more minutes, Zoe mumbled while I shook her. Holy shit, Ned screamed, pointing at the mastiff slamming itself into the glass. Get to the kitchen. Jennifer grabbed the fire poker and waved us through before slamming the kitchen's heavy wooden door. From outside, barks, snarls, shattering glass. Heavy canine steps across the hardwood. A long, mournful howl echoed through the cabin, and 3 sets of paws began scratching at the door. I wondered if the enormous dogs outside were calling to their master. Oh my god, what the fuck is going on? Ned jabbed his finger at my chest like all this was all my fault. Is this some kind of sick joke? Jennifer demanded. How should I know? I shouted back at Ned. I know what's going on, Zoe murmured. Amos Dietrich. We're on his mountain, and those are his dogs, just how Lee described them. Ghost dogs. Ned rolled his eyes. Come on. That mastiff out there just smashed its head against a sliding glass door until it broke. Would you call that normal dog behavior? Listen, Jennifer put her ear to the wooden door as it shook beneath the dog's attack. They're not just scratching the door, they're gnawing on it. Those aren't ordinary dogs. And speaking of Lee, where is he? I don't think he made it back last night. I thought of the smokeless chimney and the untrammeled snow. The kindly old caretaker was probably lying beneath it with his throat ripped out. Amos had come for him at last. The door rattled on its hinges. "We gotta find a way out of here." "That door's not gonna last much longer," Jennifer whispered, unlatching the small window above the sink. "Oh, sure, great plan." Ned rolled his eyes. "Let's run through the woods in sub-zero temperatures in our pajamas. What could possibly go wrong?" "What do you suggest, then?" Jennifer challenged. As much as I hated to admit it, Ned was right. Last night's fire was dead, and its warmth was fading fast. If Amos and his dogs didn't kill us, the cold would. Zoe was already struggling to keep herself from trembling. While the rest of us argued, she had been scrounging for supplies. She'd found a few cobwebby soup cans, 3 dull kitchen knives, an almost empty box of matches ... and a trapdoor. It took all our strength to heave it open, and even then the light didn't reach whatever waited at the bottom. One thing, however, was clear: we were running out of time. The timbers of the kitchen door splintered, treating us to a view of slobbering fangs. The rusty window frame screeched as Jennifer flung it open. I looked down at her bare feet. "Jen, going out there is suicide. I will not wait to die in some dark fucking hole. We gotta make a run for it." Of course, I suddenly remembered Jennifer had claustrophobia. That cellar must have looked like her worst nightmare. "I know you're scared, we all are, but nothing." "I'm going." Jennifer wiped away her tears with her pajama sleeve and leapt down into the snow. Behind us, the dogs had almost broken through. Ned, Zoe, and I sprinted for the trapdoor and slammed it shut behind us. The mastiff sniffed around and dug at the floor over our heads. But only for a moment. A horrifically human whistle split the silent winter air outside, followed by a cruel command. "Sick her, boys." First came barks, then snarls, and Jennifer began to scream. Maybe it was a blessing that we couldn't see what was happening out among the frozen trees, but just hearing it was bad enough. I pressed my fists against my ears and shut my eyes tight against the awful ripping and gnawing, barely audible over Jennifer's screams. I had forgotten how much the cold could physically hurt. With trembling fingers, Zoe struck a match. We were in a low-ceilinged dirt cellar. Decades of cobwebs hung like hideous curtains above us, and generations of junk had been scattered carelessly across the uneven ground. We rummaged through it by matchlight, looking for something, anything that we could use. "Hey dirt," Ned shouted. He'd found a canvas sack full of moth-eaten wool blankets, leather boots, and parkas beneath a heap of snowshoes. We bundled up immediately, grateful for the warmth, but there was little else of value in the heaped rubbish around us ... and we were running out of matches. "This is weird." Zoe nudged me. She'd found an old wooden chest full of century-old dresses, leather bags and belts, and a tiny silver locket. The cellar ceiling groaned with heavy footsteps. Zoe instinctively pocketed the locket and grabbed my arm. "Now where'd the rest of you run off to?" The voice above us was the same one that had sixed the mastiffs on Jennifer. There was something antiquated, gravelly, and wild about it, something that made me think of the unsettling tale of the Dietrich clan. "Amos," Zoe mouthed, pointing to the far side of the cellar. The crumbling stone wall faded into blackness, but as I crawled silently closer I could see what lay above, a coal chute. An escape. The footsteps overhead left the kitchen. I imagined they were heading upstairs to check the bedrooms. We had shoes and a way of keeping warm, even if they were filthy and fit badly. If we were going to try to slip out through the coal chute, it was now or never. Ned's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist as I struggled to push open the rusted chute cover. "Are you crazy?" he hissed. "Did you not hear what happened to Jen out there?" "Jen had a point, too," I whispered. "Whoever or whatever is up there is bound to check down here eventually. Do you want to be down here when that happens?" "I'll take my fucking chances." Ned had found an ice axe in the heaps of junk and held it with a white-knuckle grip. I realized that my loudmouthed childhood friend was even more frightened than Zoe, and to my surprise, Zoe's cold hand slid into mine. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded. "Come on, Ned ... come with us. There won't be another chance. No way." "I'm staying right here." Ned shook his head. The last I saw of him was his pale, stunned face watching us scramble out into the winter sun. Zoe and I trudged through the snow, afraid to look back, afraid of what might be following. We kept our eyes away from the red patches in the white where Jennifer had met her end, aiming instead for a suspicious trail of footprints that led from the woods up to Dietrich Lodge, one large human and 3 dogs. "Ghosts don't leave footprints, do they?" Zoe murmured. I shook my head, wondering where this insane day would lead us. Zoe and I had barely entered the silence of the pine forest when we heard the gunshot, the boom of a shotgun blast. Ned had been found. Zoe grabbed my arm. I could feel her warmth through our improvised blanket coats. It was what I'd dreamed of when I'd planned this vacation, alone with Zoe, holding her close in the winter woods, but my dream had turned into a nightmare. The triumphant baying of the dogs and a man's maniac laughter carried to us by the wind confirmed what we already feared. Our friend was dead. For a long minute we just held each other, listening to our thundering heartbeats, a reminder that we were still alive. But for how long? The footprints in the snow seemed to follow a sort of game trail, just like the ones Lee said the Dietriches had used. A small creek ran alongside it. My feet were exhausted from slogging through the high snow, but we had to put more distance between us and pursuit. Right around the time I lost sensation in my feet, we rounded a corner and saw a slumped-over hut up ahead. The footprints we'd been following seemed to originate there. I swallowed hard and looked back at the boulder-strewn mountainside behind us. "Hide up there," I told Zoe. "I'll see if it's safe. I'll come with you. This is no time to be a he," she began. "Listen, if it's not safe, we're both dead. This way, at least one of us makes it. Are you sure? If we don't find warmth, food, and shelter, we're dead anyway. I've got to see what's in there, and if you..." Zoe shut me up with a strong hug. "Let me go instead. I want you to keep watch for me." I didn't like the idea at all, but I could see in Zoe's eyes that her mind was made up. She left me with an extra blanket and the other supplies she'd dug out of the cellar. I set up a vantage point behind a boulder where I could see without being seen, or so I hoped. Now that the sun was setting and my sweat began to cool, I found myself rethinking what I'd said to Zoe. I'd intentionally exaggerated when I'd told her we'd die without shelter, or at least I'd thought so at the time. But as the pine tree shadows reached out for us like long fingers and the temperature dropped, I wasn't so sure. I wondered if covering ourselves with dirt would keep us warm enough, or if I'd even be able to light a fire with my shaking hands. I fiddled nervously with the first thing I grabbed out of Zoe's blanket, that weird silver locket. I realized it had a clasp. It was probably one of those necklaces that held pictures inside. Down below, Zoe was a tiny black shape on the sagging steps of the hut. She pushed open the creaking door. I was so concerned about what might come out of it that I'd forgotten to pay attention to the path below. I suddenly sensed a presence just a few feet away. "You all right, son?" a voice muttered behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin before I recognized it. Lee. I could have laughed for joy. If anyone knew a safe way off of this mountain, it was him. "We were attacked," I gasped. "I know it sounds crazy, but I think Amos and his 3 dogs. SHHH. Lee rasped. "I seen him on my way down here, but don't you worry. Everything's gonna be all right now." "Where's the girl?" "Is she?" "You mean Zoe? She's down there by the hut." "Good." Lee whistled ... and his voice changed. "Sick her, boys." 3 huge mastiffs bounded down the path toward the hut, barking loudly, and Lee stepped backward. He held an ancient shotgun in his hands. Only then did I look down at the open heart-shaped locket I held in my hands. The black and white photo on the right showed a kindly-looking woman named Alice Detritch, but the photo on the left was captioned Amos Detritch, and the face it showed was a familiar one indeed. It was staring back at me from behind the barrel of a gun. "Amos," I gasped. The dogs circled the hut below, howling. Any minute now, they'd corner Zoe. "Don't tell me you believe in ghosts. I thought you city folk were supposed to be smart." Try this on for size. Maybe Alice Dietrich survived the awful things those flashy out-of-towners did to her. Maybe she had a baby a few months later, a feral kid who raised himself after she died from her lingering injuries 10 years later. Otherwise, who would have buried her for those trappers to find? And maybe later, that kid grew up and decided he didn't want the family name to die with him. Maybe he kidnapped one of them high school girls who came up here in the 1970s and used to her get himself an heir. Maybe that heir is standing here right now, pointing all Amos rifle in the face of yet another trespasser. I lifted my hands slowly. Just don't hurt Zoe. Hurt her. No, I need her. I'm gonna breed myself an heir the same way my father did and raise him to carry on the fight till this mountain is ours again. After you four go missing, even the tourism people won't be able to cover it up anymore. Lee Dietrich's speech was cut short by the half-rotten log that slammed into the side of his head. Zoe hit him 2 or 3 more times, but I doubt the blows were necessary. Lee Dietrich had met the fate of his ancestors, but I could hear his dogs baying below ... from inside the hut. "You all right?" Zoe asked. "How did you?" I wondered. "That hut must be where he's been living." It was dim and filthy, but I saw a pile of rope right around the time I heard those dogs charging down the trail. I tied it to the front door knob and left it open just a crack while I stood by the back door and waited for my moment. When those dogs charged in, I tugged the front door shut and slipped out the back. Dietrich's dogs are trapped in there for now. I remembered how quickly the 3 mastiffs had gnawed their way through the lodge's kitchen door and shuddered. But would they even pursue us without Lee Dietrich urging them on? We didn't wait around to find out. Night had fallen by the time we reached Dietrich Lodge. It felt like years had passed since we had fled the cellar that morning. Too emotionally and physically exhausted to talk much, Zoe and I distracted ourselves with simple tasks of survival: building a fire, heating water, gathering blankets, reinforcing the doors in case the dogs came back. It had been the longest day of my life, and I ended it curled up with Zoe in front of the Dietrich Lodge fireplace. By morning, the snow had melted. The unpaved, switchbacking road off of the Dietrich mountain seemed just barely passable. Once we started driving, I realized just how much danger we were in. The back of my Corolla fishtailed around every turn, and twice the tires stuck in slushy mud and began to slide toward the cliffs beside us. When Zoe got out of the car to help me free it, I saw something that I still can't explain. Maybe it was just a hallucination brought on by stress, but I'd swear I saw another Amos Dietrich look-alike watching us from the woods. Was the mountain really haunted? Even worse, did Lee Dietrich have a brother? When I looked again, they were gone. I didn't have any answer then, and I still don't, but I suggest you stay away from Dietrich Lodge. Thanks for tuning into our scary story today. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more spooky tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on at night.